It takes a lot for a Yu-Gi-Oh card that's in a core set or a structure deck to just get noticed by the masses, because don't get me wrong, there certainly are people that enjoy playing the lesser known cards out there, but as far as competitive Yu-Gi-Oh goes, when you're looking at like a core set of 100 cards, probably less than 40 of those actually get played at competitive tournaments. For that reason, it's very important to note that for a card to actually make it into tournament level strategies is a huge deal on its own. Even if everyone isn't playing that card, the fact that some cards out there can actually make it to the top tournament tables is a pretty big deal. But there are some cards that on paper are so powerful, so influential, that people already know they're going to be at least somewhat competitively viable, or at the very least competitively experimented with, and that's definitely the case with the 2019 Megaton promo cards. I've made a bunch of videos about these cards already, and so has many other creators out there, but in today's video I was inspired by those discussions because I want to talk about 5 Yu-Gi-Oh cards that definitely were hyped when they first were revealed. On one side you had people that were playing these very powerful cards, and on the other side you had people that were playing against these cards and wanted to put in specific counters for them, or at the very least had to prepare to play against them at a tournament. And then yes, in some cases you had people doing both of those things. So people using these powerful cards were also preparing for these powerful cards, and that means that the card on release immediately warped the format. All 5 of the cards that we're going to talk about in today's video are cards that I got to experience firsthand. There certainly are cards in the past like Cyber Dragon that when they came out they changed everything, but I wasn't really playing competitively back then, so I don't want to pretend like I know how the tournaments were actually going back in the day at that time. So I want to focus on cards that I was actually playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, going to tournaments all the time, that I noticed when they came out for the weeks or months following, everyone was talking about them, everyone was playing them, and everyone was playing against them. We'll be going in chronological order for today's discussion. So at number 5 we have Soul Charge, released in mid 2014. So this thing is like a super monster born. It can bring back up to 5 monsters, and sure, it has tons of drawbacks, right? You can't go into the battle phase, you lose 1,000 life points, everything is special summon, but those drawbacks time and time again were proved to not be enough to balance the card. On release, a lot of players are playing combo decks, and while we think of combo decks as kind of crazy big summoning strategies in 2019, back in 2014 they weren't nearly as popular, but Soul Charge almost immediately changed all of that. You had decks like Dragon Rulers, which only had one of each Dragon Ruler, suddenly had this huge game-breaking card in their deck. You even had decks like Sylvans, which suddenly sort of popped up out of nowhere because of the power of Soul Charge. Sylvans were a deck that lived and died on how good Soul Charge was. When Soul Charge was at 3, the deck was very powerful, and then when Soul Charge went to 1, the deck sort of fell out of favor. It wasn't really being played even at a rogue level, and now that Soul Charge is at 0 copies, basically no one in their right mind would play Sylvans. Decks like those were really popular, don't get me wrong, but perhaps the bigger influence of Soul Charge wasn't that so many people were playing it, but that every single trap-based strategy had to have an answer to a big Soul Charge activation. Things like Bottomless Trap Hole and Torrential Tribute became near staple status in any deck playing trap cards, just because you couldn't afford to lose to a Soul Charge for 5 monsters on the first or second turn. Combo decks these days are very different than 2014, but the 2014 boards were pretty scary by those standards, and they definitely were made with the help of cards like Soul Charge. Going Lone Fire Blossom into Soul Charge to bring back the Lone Fire Blossoms was one of the best openings for a deck to have in the summer of 2014. It was all thanks to a powerful card like Soul Charge. At number 4, we'll skip forward to 2015, pretty early on in that year, and that was the Nekroz archetype, specifically Nekrasov Trishla. So I'm sure many of you are aware of what the Nekroz monsters do. They're a bunch of ritual monsters that have a ton of consistency options, and while on the field, many of the Nekroz monsters sort of break your opponent's board. One of the biggest cards that does that is the very powerful Nekrasov Trishla. On paper, you might not think that making a powerful synchro monster like Trishla, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, into a ritual monster would be a benefit. Not to mention that Nekrasov Trishla actually did have a pretty big downside that the original didn't, in that Nekrasov Trishla had to banish a card on the field, hand, and graveyard. If there was one card missing from one of those spots, it couldn't resolve its effect, unlike the original Trishla, which didn't really care if your opponent had cards on the field, hand, or graveyard. It just banished one card from each of those spots where applicable. But because of all the ritual support with both the Nekroz monsters and things like Preparation of Rites and Manju and Senju, Nekrasov Trishla was a card that you could summon consistently frequently and early in the game. What this meant is that if you were playing Nekrasov Trishla and you resolved it, you almost always won those matches. It was just way too much for those 2015 decks to actually come back from, and that meant that if you were playing Nekraz and you were playing the mirror match, very often if you go back and watch those matches, it's really funny because they have to keep clearing their own board with Nekrazov Valkyries just to not get trished. What's more important though is that if you weren't playing Nekraz, you had to have an answer to this card. In some cases, you wanted to start using cards like Effect Failure and Break the Skill to directly negate the Trishla effect, and that certainly was fine. However, sometimes your opponent had like that Book of Moon or Book of Eclipse to push that Trishla's effect through, and then you lose a bunch of cards. But what was more interesting during that format is that people found ways to, in a chain link, get rid of all the cards on their side of the field or in their hand. For example, if you were playing Burning Abyss and your opponent summoned a Trishla and attempted to use its effect while you only had one card left in hand, you could chain some sort of discarding card like Karma Cut to get rid of that last card, banish the Trishla, and now the Trishla doesn't resolve because you have no cards in your hand to banish. Shadals frequently use El Shadal Fusion, taking 2 cards out of their hand when their opponent summoned the Trishla, getting a fusion monster on the board. Yes, that's good, but also dodging the Trishla effect. There were a bunch of unique situations where people suddenly use cards that decrease their own hand during their opponent's turn just to avoid getting trished, and I thought that was pretty cool from a deck building standpoint. Of course, it's not really fun to have to keep building your decks like that. Rogue decks in particular had a huge problem facing up against the Nekraz deck. Maybe it wasn't the Nekrasov Trishla that was killing them, but oftentimes it was the Nekrasov Bryonic just bouncing back all their cards. That's probably one of the many reasons that Konami pretty much dismantled the entire Nekraz deck competitively on a ban list right after the 2015 WCQ. Next, let's skip forward to 2016 with the release of Pot of Desires, and this is a card that when it came out was very controversial, but most of the competitive players saw how good it could be. Keep in mind that upon release, Pot of Desires did not have a lot of generic counters. You didn't really see a ton of cards yet that could negate spell cards, so when Pot of Desires was activated, almost always it would resolve. This is obviously very different to nowadays, but even nowadays people are still playing the card. What happened when Pot of Desires was released is that any deck that could play that card at 3 copies suddenly had a huge advantage over their opponents, because if you're drawing 2 cards and your opponent isn't, you're going to win a lot more games just by sheer card advantage. So decks like Blue Eyes and Metal Foes and whatever you can think of that could play Pot of Desires automatically had a huge advantage over decks that couldn't play the card. There certainly were some strategies when Pot of Desires came out that were competitive without actually playing it, but in general, if you go back to 2016, right when Pot of Desires came out, almost every single deck that was topping played 3 copies of that card. Pretty crazy to think about. I mean, it's obvious, right? Because the card draws 2 cards and it's so extremely powerful, especially when there's no counters for it, but still, the card was pretty controversial. A bunch of casual players didn't really think the card was very competitive, but the facts really don't lie. The card was extremely successful upon release for months after its release, and even when we eventually got a really strong counter to it, the card still saw play for years. It is still seeing play right now in decks. That just goes to show how powerful drawing 2 cards is, even if you have to banish 10 cards from the top of your deck face down. Speaking of Pot of Desires counters, the number 2 card on this list is Ash Blossom, released in 2017. While this card, when it was first released, wasn't played in every single deck, people weren't really sure about how good it was, it certainly was very influential, and especially if you look at past strategies that were competitive, Ash Blossom in a lot of cases would have made those decks not nearly as powerful. I think of decks like Nekraz, where at the time that those cards were being played, competitively at least, you didn't really have a lot of ways to stop your opponent from doing all their search effects. However, cards like Ash Blossom prevented those effects, so when you go back and play against those decks, one of the reasons they don't seem so strong anymore is because you now have a counter that can stop Nekrasov Bryonic, Preparation of Rites, without having specific spell or monster effect negation. What made Ash Blossom so appealing though is that it just is so good against every single deck. While cards like Ghost Ogre and DD Crow and even things like Effect Failure are probably good against a variety of matchups, there's no card quite as ubiquitous as Ash Blossom. Every single deck in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! That's going to be played competitively in 2019, even the rogue decks, probably search at least once during a duel, or special summon a guy from the deck at least once, or something along those lines. It is just so common. It's really hard to find a deck out there, even the more like stun strategies like True Dracos. They have tons of effects that you can use Ash Blossom on, so it's no surprise then that Ash Blossom was so popular, that so many people have played it over the past 2 years. It's by far the most popular generic hand trap because, don't get me wrong, Droll and Lockbird, Ghost Ogre, Effect Failure, those cards are all better than Ash Blossom against certain matchups matchups in certain formats, but what makes Ash Blossom so appealing is that you always know you're going to be able to use it, no matter if you're playing against meta decks or rogue decks or something in between. And I realized that when the card was like $70 to $80 a copy, a lot of budget players, a lot of casual players complained about it, that they didn't like it in the format. And while I understand where they're coming from, I think now that the card has been reprinted, we kind of see those players not complaining anymore. And I completely understand that some really casual decks were caught in the crossfire of Ash Blossom getting released. If your deck only has one play it can make on the first turn, and that one play can get stopped by Ash Blossom, yeah, you probably weren't too happy when the card got released. But I think for casual players and competitive players alike, Ash Blossom is just very healthy to have in the metagame. Having a card that you can use against your opponent's crazy first turn combos when going second is a good thing. And if we relate it back to that discussion on Pot of Desires just a few minutes ago, I'd like to say that having Ash Blossom in a format to counter a card like Pot of Desires is only healthy for the game. When Pot of Desires was at 3 and everyone was playing it, it was because it had no counters, and the drawback is too small to actually warrant not playing the card competitively. So having a card like Ash Blossom really does make you think, is it worth putting Desires in my deck? If I use this card, do I have other things to back it up just in case my opponent hits me with an Ash Blossom? I think that sort of back and forth debate is really important for a competitive TCG like Yu-Gi-Oh! So I like having both cards available in a format. Some formats you'll see Desires played more than Ash Blossom, some formats you'll see Ash Blossom played more than Desires, but overall I think it's good to have both of them in the game at the same time. That brings us to the final card that I want to talk about, released in 2017, and that is Evenly Matched. Now don't get me wrong, Evenly Matched nowadays is kind of only known for being good against more back row heavy strategies, but what was really interesting about when this card was released, especially in the first couple months, it sort of made combo decks have to think differently about their ending board, because if you don't have a board that can negate at least one copy of Evenly Matched, you might just lose all of it on your opponent's first turn. I think from a deck building standpoint that really did advance sort of how combo decks had to think about ending on their field. Certainly in the past we had things like Dark Hole and Regeki, but even those cards weren't good enough as Konami kept printing more and more monster cards that couldn't be destroyed by card effects, or in some cases they just didn't care about being destroyed. Maybe they had a floating ability that you could use if you Regeki them or Dark Hold them. Putting a card like Evenly Matched into the game certainly made it harder for some decks out there, especially back row decks, but I think now Evenly Matched is sitting at a really good spot. If you listen to my previous discussions about the Megaton promos, you might have listened to the fact that I said if all the Guard Dragon decks start playing Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, now they don't have an out for Evenly Matched, and I think that sort of debate is really good for Yu-Gi-Oh! You can kind of see where I'm coming from on a lot of these cards. I think it's important to have discussions about deck lists. I think it's not good for all deck lists to just always be set in stone. I think having two cards like Nibiru and Evenly Matched in the format at the same time is good, because it means that combo players can't just beat everything automatically if their combo goes off. Having catch-up cards is important for a game like the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG because everything is moving so quickly all the time, and I think that having a card like Evenly Matched is overall a step in the right direction, even if, just like in the case of Ash Blossom, some more casual strategies did get caught in the crossfire because they don't have an out to the card. In general though, right now, because Solemn Judgment is at 3 copies per deck, I think a lot of those more casual decks actually do have a pretty decent counter to Evenly Matched. Evenly Matched isn't played nearly as much as some of the other cards on today's list, but certainly when it came out, everyone had to re-evaluate their ending boards. Could you actually beat an Evenly Matched, or did you just accept a loss to it? How would you actually take that deck to a tournament if you didn't have a good counter? Would you keep some cards in hand? I think stuff like that is really good for Yu-Gi-Oh! Going forward. And please keep in mind, I'm saying this as someone that plays decks that mostly lose to a resolved copy of Evenly Matched. Things like Frogs, things like Altergeist, and plenty of other rogue decks I've played all pretty much just instantly lose if your opponent manages to evenly match your entire field. Despite not enjoying just instantly losing to an Evenly Matched, I think overall the card is pretty fair. I know that might sound funny to someone that doesn't play competitively especially, but you have to keep in mind that as Evenly Matched has been out over the past 2 years, even though it's a card that when you're deck building you have to keep it in mind, there are plenty of formats over the past couple years where the card hasn't been very popular and in some cases not played at all. The truth is that there's plenty of other cards that I could have talked about in today's video, even within the timeline that this video was taken under, which was 2014 through 2017. There are so many cards that have come out that really have warped the metagame, but these were 5 that I really felt, to me personally, I noticed the most while playing competitively. Let me know in the comment section below if you'd like to see another edition of this video with some other cards, as well as your suggestions for cards that I could talk about in the future. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I'll see you in the next one. next one. Goodbye.